In the autumn of 1944, as American B-29 superfortresses carved fiery wounds across Japanese cities and the Pacific burned with the wreckage of a dying empire, there existed in the heart of Yokosuka Naval Arsenal a secret so profound that even speaking its name could mean death. Behind walls of freshly poured concrete that rose like prison ramparts, beneath camouflage netting that turned the sky into a patchwork of artificial shadows, something immense was taking shape. A steel leviathan that represented either Japan's salvation or its final, desperate delusion. The workers who labored in its shadow knew only fragments of its purpose, whispered rumors that contradicted themselves, and the constant, gnawing certainty that they were building something that should not exist. They worked 16-hour shifts in a perpetual twilight, forbidden to leave the compound, forbidden to write letters home, forbidden even to look directly at the full length of the vessel that loomed above them like a cathedral built by madmen. 2 photographs would ever be taken of this ship. Only 2 images would capture its existence before it vanished into history's darkest waters. And in those photographs, if you knew where to look, you could see the shadow of doom already settling across its decks. The war had turned. Everyone knew it, though no one dared say it aloud. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, had been gutted at Midway, bled at the Philippine Sea, and was now reduced to husbanding its dwindling fuel reserves while American carrier groups roamed the ocean with impunity. The great battleships Yamato and Musashi, those floating fortresses that were supposed to embody the invincible spirit of Bushido, had proven nearly useless in a war dominated by aircraft carriers. Yamato sat idle, too precious and too fuel-hungry to risk. Musashi had been sent to the bottom by waves of American torpedo planes, absorbing punishment that would have shattered a dozen ordinary ships before finally succumbing to physics and the sea. And here, in this concrete-walled secret, Japan was building what should have been their third sister, another Yamato-class battleship, hull number 110, with 18-inch guns capable of hurling shells the size of automobiles across 25 miles of ocean. But somewhere in the desperate calculations of 1942, as carrier aircraft demonstrated their supremacy again and again, the plan had changed. The massive hull, already partially complete, would be transformed into something entirely different. The largest aircraft carrier the world had ever seen. They called her Shinano, after an ancient province, after a name that carried weight and history. But to the workers who assembled her in secrecy and fear, she was something else entirely. An omen, a curse, a monument to ambition that had long since crossed the boundary into hubris. The conversion from battleship to carrier created a vessel of staggering dimensions. 69,000 tons of displacement, 872 feet of length, a flight deck that stretched almost 3 football fields. She was designed not as a frontline strike carrier like the lost Akagi or Kaga, but as a support vessel, a fortress meant to service other carriers, to repair damaged aircraft, to serve as a mobile base. Her armored flight deck was 8 inches thick in places, capable of shrugging off bomb hits that would cripple conventional carriers. Below decks, she could carry fighters, bombers, and the terrifying Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, the kamikaze rocket planes that pilots called cherry blossoms and Americans would call baka bombs. One-way tickets to oblivion with a human being at the controls and a ton of explosives in the nose. Shinano would carry 2,400 crew members when fully operational, along with aircraft, ammunition, fuel, and the accumulated expertise of a navy that had invented carrier warfare and was now watching its empire collapse under the weight of its own doctrines. But the ship that took shape through 1943 and 1944 was built under conditions that made completion almost impossible and perfection utterly unthinkable. The B-29 raids that began in earnest in late 1944 turned every day into a gamble. Air raid sirens would scream across Yokosuka, and workers would scatter to shelters while American bombs fell on Tokyo, on Nagoya, on the industrial heart of a nation that could no longer defend its skies. Materials were scarce. Skilled workers were scarcer. The best engineers and craftsmen had been conscripted, killed, or sent to other urgent projects. The men who welded Shinano's hull plates together worked with inferior materials, outdated equipment, and the constant knowledge that mistakes could not be corrected. There was no time, no resources, no margin for error. They worked through exhaustion, through injuries, through the kind of bone-deep fatigue that turns human beings into automatons. And they worked in fear, because the naval intelligence officers who patrolled the arsenal grounds had made it clear that the price of carelessness, of loose talk, of any security breach whatsoever, was a bullet or a rope. The secrecy surrounding Shinano was absolute and suffocating. Workers were divided into sections, each group knowing only their specific task, never seeing the whole picture. The concrete walls that surrounded the construction dock rose 30 feet high, blocking any view from outside. Reconnaissance aircraft were forbidden to fly over the area. Nearby residents were relocated. The few workers who were permitted to leave the compound after completing their assigned duties were interrogated, searched, and warned that their family's safety depended on their silence. In this atmosphere of paranoia and exhaustion, superstition took root. Sailors are superstitious by nature, and Japanese sailors more than most, and the men who labored on Shinano began to see signs and portents in every mishap, every delay, every accident. And there were accidents. Too many accidents. Small fires that broke out in electrical systems. Workers who fell from scaffolding and died on the steel decks below. Equipment failures that seemed almost deliberate in their timing. And then, on October 8, 1944, the Caisson. The day had begun like any other in the arsenal, gray, tense, filled with the clangor of hammers and the acrid smell of welding torches. Shinano sat in her dry dock, nearly complete, a mountain of gray steel that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The plan was to flood the dry dock slowly, carefully, allowing the massive carrier to settle into the water and float for the first time under her own buoyancy. Workers had spent days checking the Caisson, the massive watertight gate that held back the harbor waters, ensuring that it would open smoothly when the time came. But something went wrong. Perhaps it was sabotage, though no evidence was ever found. Perhaps it was simple structural failure, the inevitable consequence of wartime construction with inadequate materials. Whatever the cause, the Caisson failed catastrophically. Water that was supposed to enter the dock in a controlled flow instead burst through in a violent surge, a wall of seawater that smashed into Shinano's bow with the force of a tsunami. The ship lurched, her hull groaning under the uneven stress. Workers screamed and scattered, some caught in the flood, others scrambling up ladders and scaffolding to escape the churning water. When the chaos subsided and the dock was finally flooded to its proper level, damage assessments revealed that Shinano's bow had been struck hard enough to damage hull plating, twist frames, and compromise watertight integrity in the forward sections. Engineers rushed to make repairs, but there was no time for thorough work, no opportunity to take the ship back out of the water and fix things properly. They patched, they welded, they sealed, and they prayed it would be enough. Among the workers, the Caisson incident became something more than an accident. It became prophecy. Old sailors spoke in whispers about ships that were cursed from the moment their keels were laid, vessels that carried doom in their bones and would never return from their first voyage. Younger workers tried to laugh it off, but the laughter died quickly in that concrete-walled prison where exhaustion and fear had worn everyone down to raw nerves. Some of the welders swore they had seen shadows moving in Shinano's interior passages, shapes that vanished when lights were turned toward them. Others reported sounds. Groaning metal when nothing was under stress, footsteps echoing through empty compartments, voices speaking in languages no one recognized. These stories were dismissed by officers as fatigue-induced hallucinations, but they spread nonetheless, weaving themselves into the fabric of the ship's existence. Shinano was unlucky. Shinano was cursed. Shinano would never survive a real battle. These whispers followed the ship like a wake, and no amount of discipline or official denial could silence them completely. As autumn deepened and American forces captured the Philippines, Japan's situation became increasingly desperate. The need to get Shinano operational and away from Yokosuka, where she was vulnerable to bombing raids, became urgent. The ship was nowhere near ready. Her crew had conducted no sea trials, no shakedown cruises, no proper training exercises. Many of her boilers were non-functional, reducing her speed and maneuverability. Watertight compartments that were supposed to be tested individually had never been properly inspected. There simply hadn't been time. Ventilation holes that should have been sealed to make compartments truly watertight remained open because closing them would require another week of work, and there was no week to spare. Pumps that were supposed to be installed to handle flooding were missing, their delivery delayed by transport difficulties and enemy action. The ship that should have taken 4 years to build properly had been rushed to functional status in 2, and functional was a generous description. She could float, she could move, and she had guns and armor. But she was a giant with hollow bones. A fortress with secret passages that led to flooding and death. Her captain, Captain Toshio Abe, knew this. Her crew suspected it. But orders were orders, and the Emperor's Navy did not tolerate doubt. On November 28, 1944, as the sun settled toward the western horizon and painted Yokosuka Bay in shades of blood and gold, Shinano departed on her maiden and final voyage. She did not leave alone. 3 destroyers accompanied her, Isokeis, Yukikeis, and Hamikeis, veteran ships that had survived battles from the Coral Sea to Leyte Gulf and knew the taste of combat and the price of war. The carrier's decks were crowded not just with her regular crew of 2,175 sailors and officers, but also with 300 shipyard workers who were supposed to complete repairs and installations during the voyage, and 40 civilians whose presence was never fully explained. In her hangar decks sat crated aircraft and 6 Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka rocket bombs. Those piloted missiles that represented Japan's descent into weaponized desperation. The plan was straightforward. Steam south to the Kure Naval Arsenal on the inland sea, where Shinano would be fitted out with her full aircraft complement and complete her training. The voyage should have taken 2 days of cautious travel, staying close to the coast where air cover could be maintained and friendly harbors were never far away. But Captain Abe, perhaps confident in his ship's armored hull, perhaps eager to prove skeptics wrong, perhaps simply following orders from superiors who didn't understand the risks, chose to take a more direct route that led farther from shore and into waters where American submarines prowled like sharks. Meanwhile, in the cold darkness beneath the Pacific surface, Commander Joseph F. Enright was hunting. Enright commanded USS Archerfish, a Below-class submarine that had departed Pearl Harbor weeks earlier with orders to patrol the sea lanes around Japan and sink anything flying the rising sun. Enright was 37 years old, a career naval officer who had spent months feeling like a failure. His previous patrols had been disasters, torpedoes that malfunctioned, targets that escaped, opportunities wasted through bad luck or bad timing. He had been relieved of command once already, and this patrol felt like his last chance to prove he deserved to wear his dolphins and command a submarine in combat. He drove his crew hard, maintained strict discipline, and spent hours in the conning tower studying charts and intelligence reports, searching for patterns that might lead him to targets. On the night of November 28th, as Archerfish cruised on the surface to recharge batteries, the submarine's radar operator detected a contact to the northeast, something large moving south at moderate speed, accompanied by smaller escorts. Enright ordered his boat toward the contact, balancing aggression with caution, knowing that getting too close to the escorts would mean depth charges and death. What Enright couldn't know, was that the contact represented the greatest prize any submarine commander could hope for, a brand new aircraft carrier, the largest in the world, on her maiden voyage, partially completed and inadequately prepared for combat. If he had known, the knowledge might have paralyzed him with disbelief. As it was, he knew only that the radar return suggested something very large, and that large targets were worth risks. He maneuvered Archerfish into an intercept course, calculating angles and speeds with the precision of a mathematician and the instinct of a hunter. The Pacific night was calm, almost unnaturally so, with cloud cover blocking the moon and stars and turning the ocean into liquid darkness. Perfect conditions for a submarine attack. Terrible conditions for a surface ship trying to detect threats. Shinano's radar was primitive compared to American systems, and her lookouts, untrained and exhausted, stared into darkness that revealed nothing until it was too late. Hour after hour, Archerfish stalked its prey. Enright would approach, then be forced to dive when the destroyer's search patterns brought them too close. He would wait, letting the carrier group pass, then surface again to pursue, using his diesel engines to claw back lost distance. It was exhausting, frustrating work, the kind of pursuit that could last all night and end with nothing to show for it except fatigue and wasted fuel. But Enright refused to break off. Something about this contact felt different, felt important. At 3 o'clock hours on November 29th, Archerfish finally achieved a favorable position. The carrier had zigged away from her escorts, leaving herself briefly exposed, and Enright seized the moment. He positioned his submarine 1,400 yards from the target's starboard side, an optimal firing position, and ordered his torpedo tubes prepared. Through the periscope, he could see the carrier's massive silhouette, though he still couldn't identify the class or name. It didn't matter. The target was enormous, clearly a major warship, and sinking it would justify every risk. At 3:15, Enright gave the order. 6 Mark 14 torpedoes launched from Archerfish's forward tubes at 10-second intervals, their electric motors carrying them silently through the black water toward Shinano's hull. The first torpedo struck Shinano's starboard side amidships with a dull, heavy boom that seemed too small for the catastrophic damage it inflicted. The explosion tore open hull plating, collapsed internal bulkheads, and sent seawater flooding into machinery spaces and crew compartments. Before damage control teams could even respond, the second torpedo hit, then the third, then the fourth. 4 of Enright's 6 torpedoes found their target, and each one opened new wounds in Shinano's unfinished hull. The impacts themselves were devastating, but the real killer was what followed. Uncontrolled flooding that poured through compromised watertight doors, rushed along passages that were supposed to be sealed, and found every gap, every unfinished weld, every shortcut taken during construction. Water filled the starboard machinery rooms, drowning men at their stations and flooding the boilers that provided power and propulsion. It surged into storage compartments and crew berthing areas, rising with inexorable patience while sailors scrambled to escape. The ship's designers had envisioned elaborate damage control procedures, but those procedures required trained crews, functioning equipment, and systems that had been properly installed and tested. Shinano had none of these things. Captain Abe, roused from his quarters by the explosions, arrived on the bridge to find his officers in confusion and his damage control parties reporting flooding in multiple compartments. His response was catastrophic in its complacency. Abe had served on Yamato, had witnessed that battleship's incredible resilience, and he had convinced himself that Shinano, built to similar standards, could absorb torpedo damage and continue operating. He had heard American torpedoes were unreliable, that they often failed to detonate or lacked sufficient explosive power to threaten a modern capital ship. So when his officers reported 4 torpedo hits and worsening floods, Abe dismissed the severity of the damage. He refused to turn back toward shore, refused to reduce speed, refused to order general flooding of compartments to balance the ship's increasing list. Instead, he maintained course and speed, believing that Shinano could simply power through the damage and reach Kure for repairs. It was a decision that sealed the fate of everyone aboard. Below decks, reality was far different from the captain's comforting assumptions. The starboard list worsened as water accumulated in compartments that couldn't be pumped or drained. Engineering crews fought desperate battles with rising water, trying to shore up bulkheads and close doors that wouldn't seal properly. Some compartments flooded so quickly that men didn't have time to escape. They drowned in darkness, pounding on sealed hatches while water rose above their heads. The shipyard workers, theoretically present to make repairs, found themselves overwhelmed by catastrophic damage that no amount of welding or patching could fix. The ventilation holes that had never been sealed turned individual floods into widespread disasters as water flowed freely between supposedly isolated compartments. The missing pumps meant that even relatively minor flooding became critical as water accumulated faster than it could be removed. And the non-functional boilers reduced the ship's speed and maneuverability, making it impossible to get to safety quickly or execute emergency procedures that required power. As dawn approached on November 29th, Shinano's situation deteriorated from serious to critical to hopeless. The starboard list exceeded 10 degrees, then 15, making movement through passageways difficult and causing loose equipment to slide across decks. Power began failing in sections of the ship as flooding reached electrical systems. Fires broke out when seawater contacted hot machinery. The 3 escort destroyers attempted to assist, maneuvering alongside to provide pumps and additional damage control personnel, but the scale of the disaster was beyond their capacity to address. At one point, the destroyers tried to rig towing cables to drag Shinano toward shallow water where she might be beached and saved, but the cables snapped under the carrier's immense weight and momentum. The ship was dying, and everyone aboard knew it, but Japanese naval tradition demanded that they continue fighting until the emperor himself released them from duty or the ocean claimed them. Captain Abe finally accepted reality around 10 o'clock hours, when Shinano's list exceeded 20 degrees and it became clear that nothing could save her. He ordered the ship abandoned, a decision that came too late for many. Launching lifeboats from a listing deck is difficult under the best circumstances. Doing it on a ship that's dying by degrees, with untrained crew in darkness and chaos, is nearly impossible. Men leaped into the ocean from tilting decks, hoping to get clear before the ship's final plunge. Others clung to wreckage and debris, trying to stay afloat in waters that were warmer than the northern Pacific but still cold enough to kill through hypothermia. The escort destroyers moved in close, risking collision with the listing carrier to pick up survivors. Their crews threw ropes and launched boats, pulling exhausted men from the water, while Shinano groaned and settled lower with each passing minute. At 10:57 on the morning of November 29, 1944, barely 17 hours after departing Yokosuka and only 65 miles from the safety of shore, Shinano capsized and sank. The largest aircraft carrier ever built rolled onto her side with agonizing slowness, her flight deck, that armored platform that was supposed to shrug off bomb hits, disappearing beneath the waves. The final moments were almost silent, without the dramatic explosions or fireworks that marked the deaths of other capital ships. Shinano simply surrendered to physics and the sea, her hull sliding beneath the surface with a series of deep, resonant groans that sailors would hear in their nightmares for decades. She took with her more than 1,400 men. Sailors who had trained for a battle they would never fight, workers who had built the ship that killed them, civilians whose names were never recorded. The survivors bobbed in the water, watching the last bubbles rise from where their ship had been, watching the ocean smooth itself over the grave of a giant, and wondering how they would explain what had happened when no one was supposed to know the ship had ever existed. Commander Enright, unaware of the full magnitude of what he had accomplished, filed a contact report claiming to have sunk what appeared to be a large carrier. His superiors were skeptical. Japanese carriers were supposedly concentrated elsewhere, and the idea that a brand new supercarrier could be sunk on her maiden voyage seemed too good to be true. The report was noted but not celebrated, filed among hundreds of similar claims that would require verification after the war. Enright returned to Pearl Harbor with his crew, knowing they had achieved something significant, but not understanding that they had just sunk the largest carrier ever built in a single attack, setting a record that would stand for decades. In Japan, the disaster triggered a cover-up of almost pathological thoroughness. Survivors were collected from the destroyers and immediately placed under quarantine. They were interrogated, threatened, and sworn to absolute secrecy. Official records were altered or destroyed. Families of the dead were told their loved ones had been killed in training accidents or died of illness, never learning the truth. The name Shinano disappeared from naval registers as if the ship had never existed. Workers who had spent years building her were forbidden to mention their work, even to each other. The photographs, those two lonely photographs that showed the carrier in her dock, were locked away in classified archives, hidden from historians and the public. When the war ended in August 1945, American intelligence officers combing through captured documents found scattered references to a ship called Shinano, but no coherent picture emerged. Some analysts dismissed the references as disinformation or confused reports about other vessels. It was only through interrogations of Japanese naval officers, and eventually the opening of certain records, that the truth began to emerge. Japan had built the largest aircraft carrier in history, launched her in secret, and lost her to a single submarine attack before she could carry a single aircraft into combat. The story of Shinano became one of World War II's most haunting might-have-beens, a tale of ambition, desperation, and the terrible price of haste. She was built to be a fortress, armored to survive what other carriers could not, but those defenses meant nothing when basic construction was compromised by wartime shortcuts and inadequate testing. She was designed to support a carrier fleet that no longer existed, to fight a war that Japan had already lost but refused to acknowledge. She was a monument to an empire's refusal to accept defeat, a steel cathedral built by exhausted workers who sensed they were creating a tomb. And she was a secret kept so thoroughly that even her destruction was hidden, erased from history as if 69,000 tons of steel could simply vanish without trace or consequence. The men who survived carried their memories in silence for years, forbidden to speak of what they had witnessed. Some took those memories to their graves without ever telling their families why they woke screaming in the night, or why they could never look at the ocean without seeing a gray hull rolling onto its side, or why November 29th was always a day of private mourning. The families who lost loved ones were denied even the comfort of knowing how they died, told only the vaguest official lies and warned not to ask too many questions. The American submarine crew that accomplished the impossible was denied recognition for decades, their achievement buried under classification stamps and official skepticism. And the ship herself, Shinano, the giant seen only twice, rests still in the darkness off the Japanese coast, for 1,000 meters down, entombed in cold and pressure, visited only by deep-water currents and the slow decay of steel returning to the elements from which it was forged. She was launched into secrecy and sank into legend, the largest warship ever destroyed by submarine attack, a triumph of engineering made futile by the very haste that brought her into being. In her brief existence, from launch to loss measured in weeks rather than years, she embodied both the desperate ingenuity and the fatal hubris of a nation that built wonders even as it collapsed, that kept secrets so well that even disaster could be hidden, that sacrificed thousands in pursuit of victory long after victory had become impossible. The shadow of Shinano stretches across history, cast by a ship that barely existed in the light, a monument to the futility of war's final, desperate gambles and the men who died serving visions already defeated by reality.